Next is the how the non-medical use of prescription drugs affects the economy. There was a question earlier about how it's not harming anybody. I think we're going to get an economic perspective on that from Dr. John Deskins, who is the Director in Bureau of Business and Economic Research and an Associate Professor at the University of West Virginia. He has a PhD in economics that he received from the University of Tennessee, and he is focused on U.S. state economic development, small business economics, government, and tax expenditure. He has been published in several economic publications and has authored 2 books, Taxing Corporate Income in the 21st Century and What Role for Property Taxes. Welcome, Dr. John Deskins, please.
Well, thank you for having me. I have some really interesting statistics to show, and I think that some of the statistics are quite shocking in terms of the enormity of the economic impact of this problem. I'll just give you a quick preview of where I'm heading with this discussion. Most of the focus when we talk about costs is on criminal justice costs, cost of keeping a prisoner in jail, cost of treatment, healthcare costs, and those costs are important and they're very large. I don't want to give away my conclusion, but I guess I'm going to anyway. Those costs pale in comparison to the overall economic impact. If you just consider the overall productivity loss as a result of having people who are out of the workforce because they've gotten hooked on prescription drugs, that cost is extremely large. And just one more quick preview. When I get to the end, my numbers aren't as rigorous as I would hope that they would be, but they're still pretty strong and pretty convincing that if we can devote more resources to treatment and preventing prescription drug abuse and getting people off of their addiction, I think the return on investment will be tremendous, a tremendous return on investment. If we spend $1 to get, $1 that we spend in getting someone off of prescription drug abuse, it's going to give us a large return overall to our society. I do have a few background statistics. Some of you are probably very familiar with these statistics, but I thought they'd be a good motivator for my presentation overall. I refer to the National Household Survey of Drug Use and Health quite a bit through my presentation. See, 30 million Americans have abused prescription drugs at some point in their life. 15 million have done so at some point in the past year. 7 million are abusing prescription drugs. Currently, shocking statistics when you think about the size. Overall prescription medications, second most frequent new substance adults choose to use illicitly, first most frequent substance abused for kids. So just a few motivational statistics just to look at kind of direct costs, and I'm going to start with the costs that you most frequently think about, like I mentioned before. So according to the Washington Post, I mean, this is a well-known statistic, but we have nearly 2.5 million people in prison nowadays. That statistic, as you probably know, has quadrupled since 1980. Goodness gracious. For federal offenders, just over half of those offenders, their most serious charge is drug-related. I mean, I haven't broken this down quite to prescription drugs yet, but still. And you know how expensive it is to keep someone in jail, $21,000 a year up to $33,000 a year. Just look at those numbers, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. For overdose, again, to that same survey that I referred to before, significant numbers, significant increase in overdose rates recently. Number of people using prescription pain relievers for non-medical purposes grew to 5.2 million, up from 3.5 million over the 2001 to 2006 period. That's a little bit out of date, of course, but you know the numbers. CDC estimates that 15,000 people died from opioid overdose in 2008. 15,000 people died from overdose in 2008. Again, think about all the lost productivity, all of the additional years that many of those people could have worked and could have contributed to our overall economy. That's triple the number just from a few years prior to that. More deaths than heroin and cocaine combined. Prescription drugs obtained through illegal methods were associated with 63% of those deaths. Professor Pack mentioned earlier that you'd see some of these same charts over and over again, so because he issued that disclaimer, I don't feel so embarrassed about showing the same chart for the second time. But just to kind of tailor this to the Appalachian region, you see overdose rates. You see West Virginia there and Kentucky, unfortunately, are two of the dark purple states, two of the highest rates of overdose. Tennessee's in the middle. Virginia, fortunately, isn't very high, but the southwestern part of Virginia probably is atypical compared to the overall state, even though that's not broken down by region. There you see West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee had overdose rates of 26, 18, and 15 per 100,000 residents. Again, among the highest rates in the country. Poisoning deaths from opioid abuse, pretty much the same map. West Virginia and Kentucky are dark blue this time. Tennessee does show up now. It's in the worst category as well when you consider deaths. West Virginia, unfortunately, a tragic statistic from my state, had the highest rate of poisoning deaths, 15.6 deaths per 100,000 residents, 550% increase in overdose deaths in the states from 2002 to 2006. Again, I apologize that my statistics are a little bit out of date, but these are just motivators for where I'm really heading with this presentation. Overprescribing, that's pretty much the exact same figure, so I'll go through that pretty quickly. But there again, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, all dark blue. Getting to the medical costs, opioid abusers have direct health care costs that are 8 times higher than non-abusers. Direct health care costs of over $20,000 for an opioid abuser versus $2,000 or $2,500 for a non-abuser. In just a second, I'm going to start to add up these costs on all these different dimensions, and you're going to see how large the overall cost becomes. But just look what a dramatic difference there, an 8-fold difference. So most of the research, this is what I already alluded to, but most of the research focuses on the direct economic impact. So that's just the direct resources that are lost as a result of having to put people in jail, having to process people through the courts and through the legal system, et cetera, et cetera. The direct medical costs. Those direct costs, that's what gets most of the focus. But again, the indirect economic impact, by far, the biggest part of the overall problem. Here we're talking about the opportunity cost, the foregone productivity that we suffer as a society as a result of having people who lose their job because they're underperforming or because they fail a drug test, who are in jail because of drugs, who die because of drugs, or people who just simply don't want to work. I mean, I think that may be the biggest part of the picture, is that people who've gotten down the wrong path and they just have simply lost an interest in working as a result of prescription drug abuse. There's not much real rigorous research out there as to the overall economic impacts of prescription drug abuse. Again, most of the research focuses on the direct impacts, but there's not much there that really provides a rigorous a rigorous number that quantifies the overall economic impact. I found maybe 3 studies overall in the literature. I'm going to present results from this first study here, and this study is as good as any, but kind of get ahead of myself. I think this study underestimates significantly the overall economic impact. The study was by Hansen and his co-authors, Clinical Journal of Pain. The study has a national focus. I'd love to find a study, or I'd love to do a study myself in my bureau at WVU. I'd love to do a study specifically tailored to the Appalachian region. But this study has a national focus. I'm going to interpolate some of the statistics later in the presentation for the Appalachian region specifically. This study was published in 2011, but its data are from 2006, so they're a little bit old. The study considers those 5 drugs that you see. The authors estimate the economic impact of prescription drug abuse based on these based on these 4 dimensions. Again, substance abuse treatment, medical complications, criminal justice, all part of the direct impact, and then of course the productivity loss is the real heart of the Hansen study. The total economic cost that they arrive to, again, their study's a few years out of date. If you translate their number to current dollars accounting for inflation, they estimate a total economic cost in the U.S. of $62 billion lost, $62 billion worth of additional well-being that our society could enjoy if not for this tremendous problem. They use several sources, and some of their approach is a little bit fuzzy to try to very clearly identify prescription drug abusers. I'm sure that's the nature of the beast. But they use the National Survey of Drug Use and Health and other sources to try to figure out what portion of overall criminal justice costs, substance abuse treatment costs, and medical complications are attributable to prescription drug abuse. They have 3 years worth of data that they go on, but despite the fact that they have 3 years, they really have a low sample size in a lot of cases. So their estimates aren't always very precise. So I think it's important to note that caveat before we dig too deeply into the numbers. Estimated cost of substance abuse treatment, $2.2 billion. $2.2 billion sounds like a lot. If I won the lottery and if somebody said I won $2.2 billion, I'd freak out, of course. But that's only 4% of the total. Again, this is just a drop in the bucket. Substance abuse treatment, when we talk about all the money we spend, the question just a second ago was how much do you spend on, you guys remember that question from just a second ago, and his answer was $23,000 a month. That just amounts to 4%. That kind of thing altogether just amounts to 4% of the total economic impact. Estimated cost of medical complications, while they are important as well, only 2% of the total economic impact, according to the study. And I believe these numbers. If anything, I believe they're an underestimate. Criminal justice costs. Again, what we're talking about there is mostly straightforward. The study was careful to include cost of victims as well. So if I'm robbed, and if my door is broken, and if I'm traumatized, et cetera, the study did take into account those costs, fortunately. But that still just amounts to 15% of the total. $8.2 billion, but still just 15% of the total cost of prescription drug abuse. If you've been doing the math, we're only at 21% so far. Lost productivity. The authors, they start by looking at premature death. If you die at age 30 and if you're expected to have 35 more years of productivity, but for prescription drug abuse, you would be expected to have 35 more years of productivity in the workforce. They take into account, what the present value of all that additional income that you have lost as a result of this problem. They add up all of those costs. They take unemployment. They're able to consider unemployment people who have lost their jobs or people who simply aren't working very many hours. Maybe they're supposed to work five days a week, but they just help mow lawns 2 days a week because they just don't have an interest in working full time. They take into account that lost productivity, the present value of that lost productivity going forward. And of course, they take into account the lost productivity associated with people who are in jail. Overall, they come to $42 billion, nearly 4 out of every $5 worth of lost productivity, worth of the total economic impact is associated with this lost productivity. People who are just not able or not willing to work because they have succumbed to this problem. But the big shortcoming with the Hansen study and with the other couple of studies that I found that go in the same direction, the big shortcoming is they don't take into account any multiplier effect. And this is a big deal for economists. None of these studies were done by economists, but I'd love for an economist to do a study like this. I'd love for me to do one. But the idea is that if you introduce $100 worth of new spending in East Tennessee, so if if I dig up a $100 bill in my backyard that my grandpa buried back there a long, long time ago, if I introduce that new spending, that's new spending that wouldn't have otherwise occurred in the region, directly that improves the economy by the amount of the new spending. But then the person, suppose I hire somebody to paint my house. I wasn't going to paint my house. Otherwise, now I have the extra money. I'm like, okay, let's have a fresh coat. That person has additional income that he wouldn't have received otherwise. He spends the money. That next person in the third link in the chain has additional income that he wouldn't have received otherwise. We have this multiplier effect. If new spending is introduced into a region, the overall economic impact doesn't just end with that new spending itself. It multiplies. So if you take someone out of the workforce, if that person would have produced $50,000 worth of stuff, if he had an income of $50,000, if he produced $50,000 worth of stuff, if he spent that money in the region, the overall effect, if you count for an economic multiplier, would be a lot larger than just that direct cost. Unfortunately, the Hansen study, those numbers that I just pointed to, don't account for any kind of multiplier effect whatsoever. They're just direct costs. This person lost $50,000 of income, or this person has foregone $50,000 of income. That's it. They just account for that 50. There's a lot of other issues to consider in multiplier studies, but it wouldn't be common to find an economic multiplier in the range of maybe around 1.6. So for $50,000 worth of lost income, multiply that by 1.6. The overall economic impact is probably closer to $80,000 rather than just the direct impact of $50,000. So all the numbers that you saw before, it's really a lot worse than that. So now I'll tailor those national statistics from Hansen to the Appalachian region just a little bit. So how does Appalachia differ? Overall, the Appalachia region is so large and so diverse, it's hard to say. Appalachian Regional Commission says that prescription drug abuse rates in the region are pretty much in line with the nation as a whole, if you consider the entire region. But if you look at certain parts of Appalachia, you have areas that are especially hard hit. You see central and southern Appalachia, significantly higher rates of abuse. If you remember some of the figures from earlier, those really dark counties in southern West Virginia, those coal mining regions, abuse are even much higher there as well. Appalachian youth, same story. Abuse among Appalachian youth in certain parts of the region is significantly higher than in other parts of the country. There's that same picture again. You can see the really dark parts in a couple different parts of West Virginia, for a ton of Kentucky, and of course for where we are right now here in East Tennessee. So what I've done, I haven't provided my own specific estimate of the economic impact of prescription drug abuse that fully takes into account a multiplier effect like I think such an estimate should. All I've done for this is I've taken, in general, the number that Hansen arrived at, taken into account all those indirect and direct costs, and I've just kind of applied those to Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. I apologize to the Virginians in the crowd. You're left out. I'm a Virginian originally, so I can sympathize with you. But I've just applied those overall national statistics to the 3 states, and I've taken into account, obviously the state populations, but I've taken into account the higher rates of abuse that we see in those states. So starting in West Virginia, I estimate that the overall economic impact of prescription drug abuse in West Virginia, $393 million. To put that number into context, it's equivalent to the entire amount state and local governments of West Virginia spend on police. All the resources that we devote to police in the entire state of West Virginia is equivalent to, the lost well-being that society could enjoy. It's not being enjoyed as a result of prescription drug abuse. To apply the number to Kentucky, obviously the population of Kentucky is a lot higher. There the cost is $927 million, greater than the entire amount the state spends on elementary and secondary education. A tremendous economic impact if you consider the lost productivity. For Tennessee, where we stand right now, $1.4 billion, for goodness sakes, almost equivalent to the entire amount the state spends on highways annually. Before I close, I have a few more important points to make. But before I close, I did find some really interesting research on substitution effects between prescription drug abuse, opioid abuse, and heroin abuse. As you see, overall, during those years, 2000, 2004, the number of people being treated for heroin fell in the U.S., but in the Appalachian region, the number of heroin people being treated for that rose. Seems likely that it was rising in conjunction with the prescription drug abuse. Found some data on the cost of heroin versus the cost of prescription drugs. And the costs are, in some cases, I don't have the details up here in terms of the context of those prices, but in some cases the differential can be striking, and you can imagine that some people who have become originally addicted to prescription drugs have switched over to heroin. According to the LA Times, dealers in the country seek out areas with high rates of prescription drug abuse because they think the market for heroin is going to be stronger there. So we have evidence of people who deal heroin who track down pockets of prescription drug abuse because they think those markets are going to be more robust for them. Addicts are often targeted by heroin dealers as they leave treatment centers because those dealers know the market's there. So just really quickly, it seems like a two-pronged approach is necessary. One must also consider the heroin problem in conjunction with the prescription drug problem. That's probably not shocking to anyone in here, but it was an interesting bit that I found in my research. To close, I have a few charts that outline just a few of the costs that I associated with drug abuse treatment. From the National Institute of Drug Abuse, average cost for one year of methadone maintenance treatment, approximately $4,700 per patient. Compare that to the 1 full year of imprisonment, $24,000 per person. That's probably a statistic that you're familiar with, but quite the sharp differential. Every dollar invested, look at this statistic. This statistic is probably the most important one of the whole presentation. Every dollar invested in addiction treatment programs yields a return between $4 and $7 in reducing drug-related crime, criminal justice costs, and theft. So the National Institute of Drug Abuse has already estimated a very high return on investment. $1 in addiction treatment yields a return between $4 and $7. But remember, the point of this presentation is those dimensions, related crime, criminal justice costs, and theft, those dimensions only make up 1/5 of the picture. Basically, you need to multiply that $4 to $7 up by that ratio, and you need to multiply those statistics by like 4 or 5 to get the true return on investment for $1 of addiction treatment. The return on investment is enormous if you consider the total economic impacts. Even just this seems like enormous, but if you consider the total economic impacts, it really is out there. Cost of drug rehab, again, see the $19,000 figure, the $6,000 or the $7,000 figure there. Overall, those numbers pale, absolutely pale in comparison to the economic impacts that I just mentioned, the $60-some billion economic impact that I mentioned, which I think is underestimated by at least by maybe around a factor of 1.6 or so. Those numbers pale in comparison. I'm going to plug my bureau here. Again, nobody has done a study on the economic impact of prescription drug abuse in Appalachia, to my knowledge, and especially no one has done one anywhere, to my knowledge, that fully takes into account an economic multiplier, which really changes the size of the numbers. My bureau, I'd love to do a study like this, so hopefully I can find an opportunity to do that. Just real quickly, just recently my bureau, we have a lot of experience in this type of project. We just recently did a study that was sponsored by a national organization on the economic impact of cancer in West Virginia. Cancer, of course, doesn't take into account the criminal justice issues, but it doesn't take into account the health care costs and the lost productivity that result from people who have cancer. the study that we did could be very easily translated. At least, I mean, I'd have to find different data, of course, but the methodology that we use to account for lost productivity and direct medical costs could be easily translatable to prescription drug abuse, so I'd love to do such a study. Thank you all for listening to me. I hope those statistics were interesting and of value. My slides are available at the front desk if you want to pick up a printout of my slides. They're available up there, so feel free to do so. This was really an interesting presentation for me. I mean, it was mentioned earlier that everybody in Appalachia has some connection to this problem. Just, I don't know, my best friend from elementary school, when we were 22 years old, he and I kind of lost touch after high school, so after 18. But when we were 22 years old, he got addicted to OxyContin, and next thing I know, right now he's about in the middle of a 21-year prison sentence. My best friend from elementary school, and I've reconnected with him after he went to prison, and I've been writing letters back and forth to him in prison. And not to mention just the suffering that he's gone through and that his family's gone through, but look at all the years that he could have been a productive member of our workforce, and he's not. I'm almost at 30 minutes, which was my time allotted. I maybe have time for one or two quick questions, or we can catch up so we won't be late for lunch. Okay, thank you.